Uh, Before we begin, I want to announce to you students in particular that there will be two interactive opportunities with Katharine. The first is going to be a lunch tomorrow in the large boardroom right after chapel. I've ordered food for 30. Food is free, so come on out and have a discussion with Katharine. And on Wednesday afternoon, we'll have coffee time office hours in Folio at about 2 p.m. So you're welcome to both of those events. Dr. Katharine Hayhoe is a Canadian. She is an atmospheric science, lives and works in Texas. She's the director of the Climate Science Center at Texas Tech University and is a well-known expert in climate change. She's well-known enough, in fact, that she was recently invited by Leonardo DiCaprio to attend a panel discussion with Barack Obama, rubbing shoulders with those two. We're delighted that Katharine can join us this week, and also that we can save carbon emissions practicing what we are preaching by having our conversations over two-way live video streaming, which hopefully will work. This is a conversation, not just a presentation, and so there's time for questions and answers, questions and responses at the end, and that's why we have the microphones here. Prepare your responses, and I'll moderate some questions at the end. So, Katharine, please, welcome here. Can you see me?
I can.
Good. How about the rest of us? And the audience?
Yes, I can see everybody too. This is great, actually. I can see all your faces.
Welcome, please.
Yes.
Tell us what it's like to be a scientist.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can. Thank you. Tell us what it's like to be a scientist in a post-truth world.
Okay. All right. So I have about 20 minutes prepared to kind of go through a PowerPoint because as a scientist, it's easier for me to organize my thoughts like that. Hopefully you'll be able to see it and me at the same time. And then if you have any questions, I would love to discuss. So let me see if I can share my screen. Here we go. And here is the presentation. Okay. Does everybody see a picture of some water under a window?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. This is an interesting topic, and it's one that's very near and dear to my heart because we hear the words fake news and post-truth bandied about nearly everywhere these days, it seems, but nowhere is the contrast between truth and falsehood, between real news and fake news, more obvious, I think, than in the area I study, where there are some incredibly immutable truths that are evident to anybody who spends 5 minutes looking at the information. Yet at the same time, you can find one or more articles every single day saying exactly the opposite of what we've known for decades and even centuries. So I'm going to show you the second half of this picture. All right, just checking that you can see the slides change. Can you see the second half of the picture? Yes?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I see some nods. Excellent. I love this picture. It's attributed to Bagsu. I love this picture because it really perfectly encapsulates the issue we have today. The number one question people always have is, do you believe in global warming? And when people ask me that, my answer usually surprises them. My answer is actually no. I don't believe in global warming. And then that kind of stops the conversation dead right there because the person asking me that was usually somebody who doesn't think global warming is real. And then they say, well, but I thought you studied climate change. And I say, well, yes, I do. But the word there that I don't agree with is belief. Here's why. So we're all probably familiar with this verse in Hebrews, right? Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. If I had been back there when the author of Hebrews was writing this book, I would have jogged their elbow and I would have said, well, you got to finish the verse because there's like a second half there. Literally, faith in science are two sides of the coin. Science is the substance of things that are here and now, in the physical, in the present, in the now, and the evidence specifically of what we can observe. In fact, science is actually bounded by what is possible to observe. I love it that Google gives us almost the same definition. These are the Google definitions. Science is the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observing and experimenting. On the other hand, faith is a strong belief that is based on spiritual apprehension rather than physical proof from observing. So in other words, science is not faith. They're not in conflict because they're not the same thing. I love this quote. This quote is actually from an atheist, but I think it's pertinent for all of us. Scientists do not join hands every Sunday singing, "Yes, gravity is real, I will have faith." Whether you believe in gravity or not, no matter what your opinion is of gravity, if you step off the cliff, you are going down, just like this horse. And yes, I actually managed to find somebody had painted a picture of a horse falling off a cliff. So one of the biggest things that I've learned is that faith and science are not in competition. They're not two alternate and mutually exclusive systems of belief, but at the same time, we need them both. And pertinent to our topic today, they are both based on truth. So let me go briefly through a couple of things that if we study climate science, we know are true. And then end with, well, what does our faith say about how we relate to this scientific truth? The first thing that science can tell us is that climate is changing, and it's changing very quickly today. It might not feel like that on a cold day. On a cold day, we all would like a little more global warming. But the reality is, all around our world, things are changing quite rapidly. Now, we're not talking about weather. Weather is kind of like a single tree. Weather is what happens in a certain place at a certain time. Climate is like the forest. It's like looking at all the trees at the same time. Climate is the long-term average of weather over at least 20 to 30 years. So is climate changing? Yes. If we look at global average temperature, it goes up and down from year to year. That's weather. But over long climate timescales, 20 to 30 years, it's going up. And in fact, the last 3 years, 2014, 2015, and 2016, were all the warmest year on record. Will next year be another warmest year on record? I don't think so. I think it's going to go down a bit and then go back up after that. We're seeing these changes all across Canada. Now, the prairies and the north have actually warmed the most. This is showing how much it's warmed across Canada, and the darker colors are greater warming, and you can look at the individual seasons here. If we don't trust thermometers, if we don't trust satellites, all we have to do is look around us. In the world around us, there are more than 26,500 indicators of a warming planet. Like what? Like the tulips flowering now weeks earlier in the year than they used to. Like where I'm from, Toronto, having entire winters with no snow. Having glaciers melting and sea level rising and all kinds of birds and insects and animals and even trees moving poleward. There's 26,500 indicators in God's creation telling us that climate is changing and it's getting warmer. The second thing that science can tell us that is true is, for the first time in the history of the planet, it really is us, and it really isn't a natural cycle or the sun anymore. So when we study climate, the first thing we do is we say, is it changing because of a natural cause like it always has before? Couldn't it just be a natural cycle, or maybe it's just the sun? Here's the thing, though. When we look at the energy from the sun, at the same time when the world's been warming, the energy from the sun has been going down. So in other words, if our Earth's temperature, the orange line, were controlled by the sun, the blue line, we'd actually be getting cooler now, not warmer. So it can't be the sun, and that's the truth. What about natural cycles? Well, we all know that it used to be a lot colder a long time ago. There was an ice age where ice covered most of Canada, except for parts of the Yukon, ironically. And so people say, well, aren't we just getting warmer after the last ice age? But if we look at the data, this is our global temperature over the last 6,000 years. We see that actually warming after the last ice age peaked even further back than that. And we were on a long-term slow decline into the next ice age. Isn't that crazy? The next thing on our agenda was another ice age until something happened. What happened? There's a clue there on the bottom. Carbon dioxide is a heat-trapping gas that is produced whenever we burn coal or gas or oil. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, as you saw in that previous figure, right? That was when things started to head up. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, we've been burning a lot of this stuff. This is how much carbon we produce by burning coal and gas and oil. Why do we care about it? It's because it wraps an extra blanket around our Earth that we don't need. Our planet already has the perfect blanket that keeps us just the right temperature for life, and we are wrapping an extra blanket around it. And what happens if you're sleeping at night and somebody, usually your grandma, sneaks into the room when you're asleep and puts an extra blanket on you? You wake up sweating because you didn't need that extra blanket because it's trapping too much of your body heat under the covers. And that's exactly what this stuff is doing to our planet. Burning all of this coal and gas and oil produces carbon dioxide. It's building up in the atmosphere, and it's trapping more heat. That's why our planet is warming today. And here's the crazy thing, okay? We have known that burning coal and gas and oil is wrapping this extra blanket around the planet since the work of John Tyndall, a British physicist in the 1850s. We've known how much the world would warm because of this extra blanket since the work of this guy called Arrhenius, the guy in the middle, a Swedish chemist in the 1890s. And we've actually measured the warming of the planet due to human activities since the work of Guy Callendar, who was actually born in Canada, but then moved back to England with his family when he was 4 years old. So they usually call him British, but we'll call him Canadian. Guy was the first person to publish a paper in 1938 showing that he's measured how much the world is warming because of all of this fossil fuel use. So the fact is, climate is changing. It really is us. And the third thing that science can tell us is, it's bad. It really is. That's why we care. What's happening? Well, when you talk about climate change, usually this is the first picture that comes to people's minds, right? And actually, the last time I was in Winnipeg, I was on my way up to Churchill to spend some time with the scientists up there who study the polar bears. The reason why I went to Churchill, though, was because of something they said to me that I'll never forget. These guys who've spent their entire life studying the polar bears, one of the scientists, the guy who got in touch with me to invite me to go, I jokingly asked him, how many times have you given mouth-to-nose resuscitation to a polar bear? And he actually stopped, and he started to think about it, and he counted in his head, and then he said, I think about 11 times. I was like, what? He said, yeah, you have to be careful. Once they start to come to you, you have to get away from them fast. So this is what that man said to me, though, when he asked me to go study the polar bears. I said, well, I normally study how climate change affects people. And he said something that I'll never forget. He said, we care about polar bears because they are warning us what's going to happen to people next. Why do we care about a changing climate? It isn't just because of a 1 degree Celsius change in the average temperature of the planet. We care about it because it's making our heat waves stronger and more frequent. This is a picture of a heat wave they had in Australia 5 years ago. It was so extreme, they had to add a new color to their temperature map. You see that purple in the middle? That's 54 degrees Celsius. Why do we care about heat waves? Because people die in heat waves. The European heat wave of now 13 years ago, 70,000 people died. This is a more recent heat wave from a year ago last summer, and it was underestimating the number of people who died in India. Why else do we care? In a warmer world, water evaporates faster, and so when a storm comes along, there's more water vapor sitting up there for that storm to pick up and dump on us. That's why we're seeing these crazy rainfalls like they saw in Calgary a couple of years ago, and that they're seeing in other places. This is what it looks like in Pakistan, where people don't have flood insurance, and they don't have the infrastructure to cope with the impacts. Why else do we care about a changing climate? This was an article in the Harvard Business Review. This is not the David Suzuki Foundation. This is the Harvard Business Review saying that climate change could cost investors trillions of dollars. Sea level rise, flooding infrastructure, heavy rain events, flooding infrastructure. Heat waves actually melt roads and shut down power grids. They also affect agriculture. We care about a changing climate because it's exacerbating a lot of the natural weather risks we already face today. So how does this relate to the truth of what we believe, though, as Christians? And I want to plant a few ideas here that I've been thinking about myself, but we'll get a lot more into this type of stuff in the chapel tomorrow. So one of the big questions people often have is, well, doesn't the idea that humans could affect the planet challenge God's sovereignty? In other words, are you saying God isn't in control? Because I can't believe that. And it is true. One of the biggest things we believe is that God is all powerful, right? God is sovereign. So that's why I love this verse from Genesis. And this is actually taken from the Message version. It says, God said, let us make humans in our image so that. Why were we made in God's image? The rest of the verse continues. So that they can be responsible for everything on this home that God has given us. It's like God set up the best home in the world. He put us in it. And he said, you are responsible for this home. So can we affect our home? Clearly we can. All you have to do is get in an airplane and see humans spread across the face of the planet. Everybody's seen air pollution. Everybody knows about deforestation and extinction. Of course we can affect our planet because God put us in charge. He made it that way. This has led to the idea of creation care or caring for God's creation. But when it comes to climate change, I don't think we can stop there. Because throughout the New Testament, it talks a lot less about nature and a lot more about people, about loving other people, and about how we as Christians are to be recognized by our love for others. A concept that I feel like is becoming increasingly relevant in the world we live in today. So how does this relate to climate change? When we look at what countries are most vulnerable to a changing climate, this is what the map looks like. What's your reaction to this? Our reaction often is, that's not fair. So we don't just care about a changing climate because it affects us. We care about it because it disproportionately affects the poor and the vulnerable and the very people that we as Christians are told in the Bible to care for. So faith and science, they're both based on truth, but they're not competing with each other because science tells us what's happening and our faith tells us how to respond. Yet we need to come at both of them from the perspective of truth, otherwise we will be led astray. And so one of the most important verses for me personally that really speaks to me when I think about both the truth of the science and the truth of the scripture is this last verse. It's this verse from Timothy that talks about how we are to respond to issues that we see around us. So often we respond with fear. And when we turn on the TV or when we look at our favorite news website, fear is the response that people have, whether it's fear to people who are different, or it's fear to people who are against people who are different, or whatever type of fear it is. But what I love about this verse is it says that's not how we're supposed to respond. God has not given us the spirit of fear. So if we're responding with fear, the truth of God's word tells us that is not coming from God. What is coming from God? A spirit of power, get stuff done, not being paralyzed by fear. A spirit of love for others, and, I love this one, a sound mind. God has given us a sound mind to make decisions and to act based on truth. And that's what I think is so amazing about what we believe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katharine. We'll take some questions. We have about 10 minutes. Any question that you've ever wanted to ask someone who rubbed shoulders with Leonardo DiCaprio? Any question that you've ever wanted to ask about a Canadian climate scientist living in Texas?
Texas is a different country, and I don't mean the United States.
Yeah, come to the microphone. While Richard comes, this is Richard Penner, and it's thanks to Richard that we have these events. We're very grateful.
Awesome.
On the subject of carbon dioxide, what do we tell the people that tell us that carbon dioxide levels on the Earth were up to 4 times as high as they are now, and there was life on Earth? I believe this was during the dinosaur days. I don't know if that's all true, but I'd like your comment on that.
Sure, thank you. Let me first say that there is this awesome website called Skeptical Science. I don't know if you've heard about it. Skeptical Science also even has an iPhone app. And I love it because they have gone through and they have documented every single but what about question about the science of climate change that you can imagine. In 5 years, I have only found 2 questions that they hadn't answered. And I emailed them and told them about it, and then they answered. So now there's no questions that they haven't answered that I know of. And what I love best about Skeptical Science is, and this isn't very well known, it is the brainchild of a guy called John Cook, who's an Australian, and he's actually a Christian. He would get into arguments with his father-in-law all the time around the dining room table, and finally he's just like, I'm just going to make a website, because John is committed to truth, because that's who we are as Christians. So the website itself is not Christian per se. You can't tell by looking at it, but I'm letting you know that John made it because of the commitment to truth that we have as Christians, as well as scientists. So that was a great question about, wasn't it warmer way back when? And were carbon dioxide levels higher? Yes. So when we look way back in time, we see that way far back, during the times of the dinosaurs, carbon dioxide levels were, and get this, were what we expect them to be by the end of this century if we don't wean ourselves off fossil fuels. So where we will be at the end of the century is basically at the very peak of what we've ever seen happen on the Earth as far back as paleo records can go. Now, back then, sea level was not centimeters higher than today. It was not meters higher today. It was hundreds of meters higher than today. Hundreds. 2/3 of the world's biggest cities lie within a meter of the coast. If we were even halfway back to those times, in terms of sea level rise, the land that 2.5 billion people live on would be underwater. So the answer to that question is sure, there have been natural cycles in the past. Climate has been more extreme in the past, but it's never been so extreme with 7.5 billion people living on the planet. A lot of people say we have to save the Earth. The Earth is actually going to be okay. The question is people. After the polar bears, we're one of the most vulnerable species on the planet. Why? Because we've built all our infrastructure assuming a stable climate. How are we going to pick up 2/3 of the world's biggest cities and move them within a matter of 50 to 60 years? What if, the place where you grow, whatever crop it is you grow, gets too warm and you can't grow it there anymore? You can't just pick up and move because somebody else owns that other land. So we've built our vulnerability into our system. And the reason we care about a changing climate is because we can't pick up 7.5 billion people and move them. That's why it matters so much today. And thank you. That was a great question.
Thank you so much. I saw another hand. Yes, please. State your name. Thank you before the question.
Hi, Dr. Katharine. This is Napoleon. I actually have like 5 questions, but I'm just going to try to be precise with the one that's most concerning me. We know that one time I read in the book that 3/4 of the terrestrial in the environment is covered by trees. And we know that trees use carbon dioxide to produce food through photosynthesis. Then if that much number of trees is covering our environment or our planet, how come that there is a huge number of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Another thing is that what is the life expectancy of carbon dioxide itself in the atmosphere? Is it the idea of global warming, is it a religious belief, or is it just a fiction that governments are trying to control people from using fuels in order to develop their life and their countries? So, yeah, I will stop here.
Okay. So a lot of those questions are answered in physical science. So I definitely encourage you to check that out. I'll answer some of them very briefly. First of all, trees and the biosphere in general is actually in balance with the atmosphere. So the biosphere produces a huge amount of carbon dioxide every year, over 100 gigatons a year. But you know what? The biosphere takes up about the same amount. The ocean produces about 90 gigatons a year, and it takes up the same amount. Humans produce about 10 gigatons a year. So that's not much, right? You got 90, you got 100. Humans produce 10, But you know how much we take up every year? 0. So that's how we're affecting something as big as our planet, because you have, about 200 gigatons going into the atmosphere from the ocean and the biosphere. And you have about 200 gigatons going out of the atmosphere from the ocean and the biosphere. And then you have humans putting an extra 10 on the side. And guess what happens? It tips the balance. Carbon dioxide lasts, an individual molecule lasts on average about 100 years in the atmosphere. But we have perturbed the natural carbon cycle that moves carbon back and forth between the ocean and the biosphere and the lithosphere. That's like rocks. We have perturbed that carbon cycle so much that if you just, if humans just disappeared off the face of the earth today, no, we don't want that to happen. But if that happened and some alien landed on the planet later, they would still be able to see that something had happened. The carbon cycle was still messed up as far as about 10,000 years in the future. That's the significant impact that we've had by digging up all of this carbon underground and burning it, because otherwise that carbon will still be underground. It wouldn't get released into the atmosphere for very, very long periods of time. And then the last question is a great question. So I have an essay I wrote called Climate, Politics, and Religion. It's on prairiefire.com. So if you look up Prairie Fire in my name, you might want to read this interesting essay. I also have these little global warming videos you might have seen, and not the one from this past week, but the one before that is all about the Bible and climate change. So the short answer is, we know that climate is changing. We know humans are responsible for the first time ever in the history of the planet. And we know it's real based on science that goes back 160 years. Scientists have been studying this for 160 years. 51 years ago, scientists were so sure this was a problem that they actually formally warned a U.S. president of the dangers of climate change. Isn't that crazy? So this is not something that was invented by government. It's been in the scientific literature since the 1950s. You can read the original papers. They're crazy. It's so interesting. The reality is that there is government and politics involved. And not to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but this is something I've experienced myself. The fossil fuel industry puts a large amount of money into organizations specifically designed to lobby elected officials, especially in the United States, but some in Canada too, more in the United States, to lobby elected officials to support their policies because they're the ones who have more money, not the clean energy industry. The fossil fuel industry has more money. And they also pay these organizations to harass scientists. How do I know? Because they've harassed me. How do I know that that's who they paid? Because Peabody Coal went bankrupt last year. And so all of their communications became public. They had emails to the organization that harassed me, specifically directing them to show that we were, nefariously manipulating data through whatever means that they could. So the coal company was funding this, shady legal company to actually attack me and other scientists. So this is what's happening in an attempt to discredit the science of climate change. So yes, there are unfortunately some conspiracies going on, but it's not in the science. The science has been around for 150 years.
Wow.
It was certainly interesting to see your name show up in those email communications when you don't expect it.
It's 12 o'clock, but if there is, we can take one more question. Thanks. Say who you are, Rick.
Hi, my name is Rick Unger. My thought is when people compare that climate change, the climate has increased in temperature previously. Has it ever increased at the rate that it's increased in our lifetime or since Industrial Revolution? And to that end, will life on the planet be able to adapt as it has in the past to climate change that has happened in the past? Thanks.
Thank you, Rick. That is an excellent question. Have we ever seen climate changing this fast? We certainly know that it has changed in the past. There used to be crocodiles at the North Pole during the time of the dinosaurs, so clearly the Earth was very different. When we look back in time, there's this one period called the thermal maximum, a very long time ago, when climate was changing the quickest. So this is a single time you can identify in the paleo record when climate was changing very quickly due to massive amounts of carbon dioxide in the ocean being released into the atmosphere. So it was the same mechanism. It was just natural that time. So scientists have actually been able to estimate from sediment cores in the ocean that keep records from a long time ago. They've been able to estimate what was the average rate of carbon dioxide per year. Now, average, over 1,000 years, what was the average per year? So the average peak emissions back then were about 1 gigaton of extra carbon per year. So, we have that balance, right? The ocean's producing and then the ocean's taking up. And then during this time of peak change, it was producing 1 extra gigaton a year. How much are we producing now? 10 gigatons per year. So the reality is that we're conducting an experiment with our planet that we have never seen before. And Earth will survive, but many species will not because they literally can't adapt fast enough. And many species won't be able to move poleward fast enough because their habitat has been fragmented by human development. I was studying a ground squirrel, sort of like a prairie dog, that lives in Michigan, and it likes really cold winters. And so it's been migrating north, but it's actually getting stuck at the top end of Michigan. There's no way for it to get around. It was trying to go through Chicago, but Chicago covers such a huge area that they can't really migrate through Chicago either. So with that specific species, which is endangered, they're looking at trap and release, where they catch all the little animals, in southern Michigan, and they release them on the other side, up in Canada. But you can't do that for all of the world's species. And so it's estimated that if we continue on our current pathway, if we reach the very highest level we've ever seen of carbon dioxide by the end of the century, then up to 30% of the world's species could become extinct. 30% of the living things that in Genesis 1 we are told to have responsibility for.
Wow. Katharine, thank you so much. So we've heard some bad news. Are we going to hear some good news from you?
Yes, thank you for ending on that note. I hate to end on a bad note. So living in the States, there's a lot of bad news these days about climate and clean energy versus coal. But I do a lot of work with cities. And I also follow a lot of news about what's going on with clean energy, not just in Canada or the States, but also in China and India and Cambodia and Uruguay. And so what encourages me, and I actually do this deliberately, I follow a couple of different people on Facebook, Skeptical Science is one, that post good news stories. Because the good news is that the world is changing. China is actually cutting its coal emissions and shutting down half-built coal plants. China has more wind and solar energy, I should say, than any other country in the world at this point. And they're putting solar panels up on thatched roof huts in Africa that don't have an electricity grid. And they're going in 100% renewable, at public schools in Uruguay. So I get excited when I look at what people are doing. But when I look at the science of what we're doing to our planet, that is where the concern comes in.
Look forward to the continuing conversation with you. Chapel tomorrow at 11:30 in this space. Lunch afterwards. Coffee on Wednesday afternoon, and the public lecture Wednesday evening. Thanks again for joining us, Katharine.
Thank you.